like to turn to the present and talk a little bit about the present. And I'd like, for each of you to sort of think about, what's good about what we have now, and some of the challenges that are involved in the sort of the system that we've helped create. And maybe start with the other side, with Ellen, and with Laura.
The perspective that I will share with you is one that's been framed largely by working in one community. And that perspective has shaped my experience. And it's the community of Washington Heights and West Harlem, the low-income communities where roughly 70% of the children there live in poverty. And I think my perspective would be different were I to be citing projects in Midtown or elsewhere. That originally we created the old-fashioned single-room occupancy hotels because we were following the Franciscans and we did it what they did. And yet we didn't have the Catholic coffers behind us, so we had to go to government and ask them for the money. And being organizers by spirit, we had a tenant patrol, an old-fashioned tenant patrol, rather than case management staff. And it wasn't until later that we joined up with what was then known as Columbia University Community Services to provide mental health programs. If I could wind the clock back, I would sort of change that orientation to be limited only to single men and women and adults, and I would have included families from the beginning. By about 1990, we'd figured out, because by that time we developed 4 supportive housing projects, that the longer people stay housed, the more children arrive on the scene. And it normalized our buildings when kids came to visit and realized that their parents had it, relatively speaking, together, and they weren't quite so ashamed or embarrassed about their behavior, and they basically had a place where they were welcome to stay overnight. That children changed the character of our buildings. And so it was by the 1990s that we approached government and said, really, we'd like to have the Rio building half for families and half for individuals. And they can all come from the system and from the community, and we'll do an integrated tenancy. That, I think, has been what we've lost in recent years as government, has increasingly attended to the cost and the frequent flyers, as they used to be called, and the people who are most costly to their system. And so increasingly, there is a force among the provider community to house only people with serious mental illness, only people who have so many days in the hospital, only people in recovery, and works against sort of a more integrated model. And that's not to say that there isn't plenty of room, because the need is so enormous that there's plenty of room for providers to do all forms of housing. But in my 30-year time span working on this, fundamentally, homelessness is about poverty. It's about very deep poverty. And that to correct that for individuals, families, and from a community perspective, it requires a much more comprehensive approach that deals both with the housing and some of the basic inequities that exist in very low-income communities. In taking a community approach, it became clear by the time we had developed our 5th building, the Rio, in the 1990s, that we had case managers, social workers, we had expertise, we could prevent evictions, we had all, and families living right across the street could not access services because they weren't residing in our building. You know, their belongings would be on the sidewalk, but they weren't tenants in our building. So as we started to, the longer we stayed, it was incumbent upon us to be more responsive to the neighbors on our street who'd gotten their Con Edison cut off, who'd lost, and people on a block find out where the case managers are and how you can get your entitlements straightened out, and they'd find us, and they'd come into the building. And when the after-school programs got shut down in 1993, by the city administration at that time, we opened one up in our tenant lounge. But that was really, the impetus for that were all the mothers and the grandmothers that lived on Fort Washington Avenue who knew we had a tenant lounge upstairs and they needed a place for their kids to get tutoring. So we became a settlement house eventually. Because we began to realize that increasingly our services were being extended to those people in our community who were in the greatest need. That as the years rolled by, the tenants in our housing became increasingly stable. Their service needs diminished and changed over time. That's not to say there's still not crises all the time. But we know how to deal with those crises. And we still have enough resources to share with the broader neighborhood.
When I first started, it was like 1979, 1980. So we had a storefront office, and I had a typewriter. And as you just said, the neighborhood knows you have an open door with a typewriter. People start coming in because they got a form that needs to get filled out, and you know what city agency to call, and so you become sort of this service for the neighborhood. And I think that we have strayed away from that. It was 34 years ago. But we have, and I think some of my staff are here, and I think they would say that some people do have, it's sort of dependent upon the program director in a particular site where they start building those networks in the neighborhood. And it starts with the families, because we have tried to replicate the model that I saw when I walked in there 35 years ago, almost 4 decades ago, that there was these families and they were living fine, and our tenants were coming from the shelter and they were moving into apartments and everybody was getting along. So it's been our goal to sort of just keep that, a very kind of normal kind of housing situation. And through those families, the kids need to get into school, they need resources. So, we begin to find out what is going on in the neighborhood and what we can do to help support them. And then I think the families in the community begin to find out that we're this resource. But I think we could be doing a lot more. We've got these beautiful community rooms, we have exercise rooms, we have computer lounges and stuff, and that, as Ellen said, there's people right across the street that could use those resources. So how do we begin to think about the model? And it is sort of become rigid. You get a set of funding for a group of people in that building, and they're not supposed to do anything outside of the building, and they're supposed to, do a certain type of, deliver a certain type of service. But we really are, and we have sited buildings all over the city. So we've tried to, first as part of the philosophy is that we're going to be a good neighbor. So the buildings are going to look nice, they're going to keep them nice, we're going to be sort of get and participate in the activities of the neighborhood to the greatest extent possible. But I think we really need to go a step beyond that and use these beautiful, and at times underutilized. The community rooms are empty half the time. There could be a senior program going on there. There could be a thing with kids. There could be, a lot of different things.
So our evolution really started and continues from our experience at Valley Lodge, which is a transitional shelter for 92 women and men, funded by DHS. It is the only shelter that WSFISH has, and it is probably, all of the buildings are very important and very special, and each one is unique. However, the staff is here. However, Valley Lodge holds a very pivotal place in the work that WSFISH does. It's the only shelter we have. It is for older people, but the age of older has slipped down to 50 and sometimes below 50. And the people who come to us from the city shelter system and also from the community are people who have had very difficult experiences in their lives. And they come to us often, someone will come in and seem to be very robust and healthy, and then all of a sudden, once they're inside and relaxed and have 3 meals a day and people who care about them, some kind of chronic illness blossoms because they're, whatever the medical reasons are, they've relaxed and their defenses are down. We have people who come to us undiagnosed and it comes to our attention that they have very serious mental illness conditions and have never had a chance to be in an environment where they can recover. So Valley Lodge, the only shelter, is where we have over the years listened and learned from the folks who live there what kind of housing they would like, they would thrive in, and that they would be able to sustain over time. And so that's really what has happened. And I think with all of supportive housing, there's a spectrum. And so at Wistfish, we have a spectrum. We have independent apartments. In large buildings, we have independent apartments in small brownstones. We have sort of typical SRO style apartments, single room supportive housing. And then we have congregate housing, which frankly, we love the best because it is a real opportunity for people to live in community. And the community is created by the individuals who live there as well as for the staff. I think that, while we don't like the idea that people have to live in our housing because of diagnosis, we also, I personally am grateful, for example, to the New York 3 initiative, which I think has taught us all of the many people with many different kinds of experiences can live and thrive in supportive housing. And I'm not sure we would have known that if we hadn't been pushed to look at different categories, different groups of presenting issues that people have. For my 40th birthday, which was many decades ago, Karen Jorgensen gave me a cartoon that the caption was, Wistfish continues to evolve. And the picture was of women in rocking chairs on a front porch kicking up their legs, and it said, "Home for old Rockettes." and I think there's a sense in Wistfish that there are folks that we know can thrive in community and will thrive in community. And they may have very specialized needs, and we want to address those needs. I think that it's not that I would want, a home for 100 Rockettes, but a home for maybe 60 Rockettes and 40 others, which is one of the which I think was Ellen's idea, actually. In the old days, in supportive housing, there was an 85-15 rule, 85% homeless, 15% non-community, right? And Ellen and others pushed for 60-40. And I think that gives us a lot of opportunity in supportive housing to help folks in the neighborhood, to please the community board, all of whose members have an uncle who needs supportive housing. And it does create a kind of integration that I think is very healthy for everybody in the building.
You want to correct that story?
What, is it your idea?
No, it was Ellen. I think you were going to go in and negotiate 75-25 as the improvement, and the city offered 60-40, and that became.
We'll take it. The easiest negotiation ever.